Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Jeff Brown. Jeff is an award winning radio producer and formerly national syndicated morning show host. After more than 25 years in the radio and music industry, Jeff started his own podcast, the Read to Lead podcast. And now, a few years later, he's bringing to us his first book, Read to Lead, a simple habit that expands your influence and boosts your career. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Alain. I'm excited to be here.
So, Jeff, I told you a minute ago that I have been listening to your podcast for a long time, and in fact, you were part of the group of people who inspired me to start my own podcast. And one thing that I haven't been able to replicate is your deep, soothing voice. I'm still working on that. But I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, you have a long career in radio, 25 years, and then you started your own podcast. Can you share with us a little bit of your journey?
Yeah, I started in radio a long, long time ago, back in, 1987, I think it was. And that was a career for me that served me well for about 25, 26 years. But around 10 years ago, I began kind of recognizing that I probably wasn't going to be doing that career forever. And I needed to be planning for life after broadcasting, life after radio. And so around 2010, I guess it was, I began a side hustle, a business on the side, just to play with and kind of, I guess, get my feet wet, as the saying goes, and understand what running a business even part time looked like, with the idea that someday I would do something on my own. I didn't really know what that was going to be, but in 2013, fast forward a few years, and I lost that radio job that I had. I had already begun making plans to leave, but about 7 months before I was going to do that, I got let go. And so that side hustle, that business I had been working on in the margins of life in my spare time for about 3 years at that point, had to quickly become my main source of income, at least for a little while, to sort of bridge the gap between losing this job and me figuring out what I wanted to ultimately do long term. Coincidentally, I had already begun planning a podcast, and it would end up launching about 1 month after I got let go. So I was doing that and working on this side business, which now is my full-time business, which was a business involved in creating websites and mobile apps for small businesses. And I did that for about 7 or 8 months full time. And within about 8 months, I was able to begin earning income that was related to the podcast that I was creating, and would eventually sort of shift gears and put my emphasis and focus on that. And that's been, 7.5, almost 8 years ago now. And somehow, some way, I managed to earn a living.
And in regards to creating your podcast, how do you stumble or how you came about the decision to make a podcast about reading, or the titles your podcast, Read to Lead?
Yeah, I was not a lover of books in junior high and middle school and high school. I loved reading as a young kid, but school, the more I got into school and learning, the more I realized how much I disliked learning and reading, at least what school told me I had to learn and read. And so when I graduated from college, and college was not something I wanted to do, and tried it a couple of times before I got it right. But as soon as I got out of college, my attitude was, boy, I'm so glad I don't have to learn anymore. I'm so glad I don't have to read anymore, because so much of that experience for me was learning and reading things I had no interest in. And so I went nearly 10 years without picking up a book. And in my early 30s, I was introduced to nonfiction, serious nonfiction, by a mentor of mine. And honestly, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, I didn't know what was out there. I didn't know that there were books out there that I could be interested in, because school taught me otherwise, and went 10 years not realizing that there were books out there I could actually find fascinating and that spoke to my interests. And so one of those first books for me was a book called Purple Cow by an author named Seth Godin, a book about marketing at its core. And that was a topic that I was trying to learn more about. And when that was presented to me and I realized what was out there, the plethora of what was out there, I just got really excited. And I began a reading journey that has continued ever since. And about 10 years into that reading journey, so 2003 to 2013, I'm 10 years in and I want to start a podcast, but I'm not sure what to start a podcast about. And I hit on the idea one day on my way home from work. I was counting up the books I had read so far. I was tracking my reading goals, and I was surprised when I realized I was reading about a book a week. I didn't know that I was doing that until about 3 months into the year, and I counted them up. It's about 12 books or maybe 11 books in 3 months. And when I said to myself out loud in the car on my way home from my job, that's a book a week, that a light bulb went off. That this spoke, podcast to me in some way. I thought maybe there's the idea I've been looking for. I thought of podcasts as weekly events. They're not all published weekly, but most of the ones I listened to were or are. And I started getting excited about this idea. So I researched the idea, the plausibility of the idea. And then I went from there to buying equipment. And then the next month I was scheduling interviews. And then the next month I was launching. So I just very methodically went about, putting it all together. And that was 8 years ago, and 400 or so episodes in, here we are.
Wow. So a book a week. What are your reading habits? Do you read every morning, every night? Do you read a certain amount of pages or a certain amount of time? How do you put it all in?
Yeah, it's certain. It's a time for more than it is pages. And for those who are setting reading goals based on number of books or pages or chapters, I would encourage you to put the emphasis on time. Set aside certain amount of minutes per day or what have you to read, and worry less about whether or not you read a certain number of pages or a certain number of chapters during that time, and worry more about, well, did you actually do what you said you were going to do with that time? Did you actually read all of that 30 minutes or all of that hour? And that's really the ultimate goal, I think. And so to your question, yes, I have time set aside every morning, at least 30 minutes to read, and then other slots throughout the week that I have set aside. And those are actually on my calendar, and I treat them just like any other appointment. And so that means that they're, to a certain extent, they're protected, just like any other appointment or meeting that I have with someone else, like this interview would be. And so when someone asks for my time, if they're wanting to meet with me or get together at a time that I might otherwise have set aside to read, I have a choice to make, don't I? I can look at that time and go, okay, I'm willing to give that up and not read and instead meet this person because that's more important and they need me and that's the right decision. Or I might look at that time and go back to them and say, you know what, I've got an appointment already at that time. Can we consider another time? And I think an appointment with yourself it should be treated just as important as an appointment you have or a meeting you have with somebody else. And so that's the way I treat my reading time. And I often, I've learned to do something different than a lot of us do. Many of us, when requests are made or demands are made of our time, we default to yes. And then if we're going to say no, we feel like we have to defend that no to the person we're saying no to. We can't let no be a complete sentence. When I think instead, we probably need to default to no. And if the answer is going to be yes, then we need to be ready to defend that yes to ourselves. And I think if we did that more, then much more of our time would be spent in ways that we feel at the end of the week or day better about.
Okay, so that was you before you started your podcast. You used to read just for habit, for fun, for learning experience, but now you have a podcast about reading and you interview people who are bringing up new books. So I assume now you read even more than before, because not only for your own pleasure, but also to prepare for the next person that you are going to interview.
Yeah, that's true. I usually have anywhere from 2 to 4 additional books that I'm reading, not simultaneously, but 2 to 4 additional books that I'm checking in with, in addition to a book I'm reading in a given week for an interview I'm about to conduct with that author. So, this week I read a book called 4-Week Vacation, and it's a book about encouraging entrepreneurs to build businesses such that they could leave for 4 weeks and it not fall apart, that it could run smoothly without them. So that's an interview I did this morning. And so I was reading that book for this week. But in addition to that book, there's other books like How to Take Smart Notes by Sanka Ahrens that I'm reading. There's a book called Do You Talk Funny, which is a book about injecting humor into your presentations. And those are those extra books, if you want to call them that, are books that I take longer to get through. So I might read just a little bit of each one of those this week as I'm able, and finish with the book that I'm going to be interviewing somebody about. And so those books, those extra books, will take me longer to get through. I'll give myself more time. Maybe those books I read over the course of a month versus a week.
Right. Okay. So in your book, you make a strong case that readers do better in their careers. Does that mean that if they read about a specific subject that they are working on, or just reading in general?
It can be both. In my career, I'll use me as an example, and then I'll expand on this. Early on, when I began my reading journey, it was a lot of marketing books, and social media was coming on strong. And so I was reading a lot of books related to social media marketing, because I needed to understand and learn these things for the sake of the radio station I worked for and the industry as a whole. Excuse me. And I thought, if I can get a handle on these things and understand how to leverage these tools, then we can strengthen the relationship we have with our listeners. So I better read about these things. So I taught myself some best practices through the books I was reading. And as I did that, I experimented on what I was learning. And the things I tried that didn't work were oddly quickly forgotten. The things that I attempted and experimented with that did work got me noticed. And that presented numerous opportunities down the road for me to do even more exciting things. I was able to then teach what I was learning, and asked to teach what I was learning to other factions within the company, because they saw that I was doing this thing, putting it into practice, executing on what I was learning, and having results from it. But, reading too, just for enjoyment, reading fiction, I think is tremendous for helping foster creativity, for empathy, for improving communication. When we read about characters in a story and how they're interacting with one another, all of those things can be impacted and can be helping us improve in those areas than when applied to our personal and work lives without us even realizing it.
Right.
So, when we read nonfiction, oftentimes we read nonfiction with the thinking that, well, when I get done, I'm going to have a to-do list from having read this book that I'm now going to go out and implement. And that can often be the case. But whether nonfiction or fiction, oftentimes, it's okay to read just for how it impacts your thinking, right? Just for how it broadens your horizons. And there may not necessarily have to be a to-do list that follows that.
I have shared this with my audience a few times, but I'll share it with you. When I was a young man, I used to be homophobic. And it was through reading fiction that I developed empathy and understanding that, it's just because other people have different sexual preferences doesn't mean that I had to dislike them or had to critique or, I don't know, judge their lifestyle. And it was just that habit of reading that I started many years ago when I was a young person. And it was nonfiction that changed my wiring in my head, because I come from a macho culture in South America, and that was the culture at the time. But being exposed to other universe through my reading, I said, wow, I think I'm on the run in this subject. And like that, I continue shifting my way of thinking almost every day. But let me ask you, so I have the feeling, and you mentioned this also, that reading is becoming something less and less popular. I think that people like us, I don't know, I'm in my 50s, I don't know how old you are, but I have this love of reading. But I think people nowadays love TikTok more than reading.
Yeah, there's a couple of issues that come up related to this. And the pushback on reading by and large is two things. People don't want to learn because learning requires acknowledging briefly that you don't know something, which we're taught to avoid. And so it's easier to not learn and just get back to whatever you're doing. And the other thing is people don't want to change their minds. If a book is going to help you get somewhere you haven't been able to get to on your own, that means you're going to have to change your mind about something. Both of those things, a lack of a desire to learn and a lack of desire to have one's horizons broadened like yours were, make us uncomfortable, get us outside our comfort zone, put us in an area of discomfort, and we don't like how that feels. But the problem then becomes, anything that requires sacrifice and growth, self-discipline, comes with pain. The pain of self-discipline that comes with sacrifice and growth is a pain we want to avoid oftentimes. But the problem with that is if we avoid that pain today that comes with sacrifice and growth, then we experience another pain later. And that's the pain of regret, the pain of wishing we had done that thing previously, before now, a year ago, read that book, learned that skill that we so desperately need, whatever it might be. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, do I want pain now or do I want pain later? And if we're willing to accept the pain of self-discipline that comes with sacrifice and growth, that oftentimes means we get to avoid the pain of regret later. It's sort of the Stoic version of this. The Stoic philosophy is easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life. And to your point about TikTok, yes, technology has rewired our brains over the last couple of decades. There is this metamorphosis happening, this evolution that's happening. Centuries of readers, books, I think, rewired our brains centuries ago to impact not just what we think about, but how we think. And I think some of that programming is being undone or changed with, give it to me in bite-sized chunks type of thinking, and everything is on demand, and our brains are again being rewired, but not necessarily in a good way. No, I don't mean to say that all technology is bad. What I am saying, though, is there is, in my opinion, still a place for traditional books. But because of these other things, our attention spans are shrinking. It is more and more difficult to expect people to sit down with a book that might take from beginning to end several hours to read. And most people, more and more, especially young people, don't have the patience for that. But I'm here to tell you, if you want to achieve your biggest dreams and your highest priorities, and if you can discipline yourself to do this one thing, reading with intention and consistency, you're going to be more likely to experience your biggest dreams and highest priorities, because by doing that one thing, reading with intention and consistency, you'll be doing one thing that most of your peers are not doing. And that alone is going to set you apart from everybody else.
Okay. There is this, I once interviewed a person who called himself the fastest reader in the world. And there is this emphasis on learning how to read fast. You talk about that in your book as well, but I don't know, maybe because English is not my first language and I read in English mostly, I like reading slow. I like reading a paragraph, then pausing, closing my eyes and visualizing the same paragraph from a different perspective, or even if it's a non-fiction book, I kind of make an image of the whatever dialogue is going on. So can you tell us about the pros and cons of reading fast versus reading slow?
Yeah, and my co-author Jesse Wisniewski is the true expert when it comes to speed reading. He and I came together on this book because we each had strengths that complemented one another well, I think, and we had some strengths that overlapped. And one of his areas of strength is the speed reading area. I'm more like you, where I would rather take a slow and steady pace to most of the books that I read. And speed reading doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're going to be less likely to retain and comprehend what you're reading. We do this thing oftentimes as adults called subvocalization when we read. And so when we're taught as children to read, we're taught to sound the words aloud, and then as we begin to learn how to read, we're being taught to and encouraged to read aloud. So that's our way of as learning as children to confirm that it's actually it's happening. We're doing it. We can actually we've attained this skill. And so we learn to sound the words aloud, to read aloud, and we carry that into adulthood. And oftentimes that can include reading to ourselves silently, but reading every word aloud in our brain, in our mind, right? And the reality is our brains can understand the information far faster than that. So oftentimes speed reading is this, idea of hopping. And think of a stop sign. When you see a stop sign, your brain doesn't stop, no pun intended, and read the word stop and then tell you what to do. You see a stop sign off in the distance and you don't read the sign. Your brain just knows you didn't have to read it to know what to do. And so when you're speed reading, you're not reading every single word. You're reading groups of words oftentimes. And there can be, again, pros and cons to that. Reading at a more leisurely pace, well, it's going to take you longer to get through most books. But if your goal is to get through more books in less time, then that's one way. Something that I have tried that's sort of a speed reading cheat, and I don't know if we talk about this in the book or not, but I like taking a physical copy of a book, and that's my preference is a physical book that I can hold in my hand, and also getting an audio book version of that and putting the audio book on 1.5 or 1.75 speed. I can't quite handle 2.0 speed, but 1.5 or 1.75 speed. So the author or the voiceover person is reading it to me at a really fast speed. They are reading every word aloud, but it's much faster oftentimes than I could read it if I were trying to read every word aloud. And then I follow along in the physical book as they're reading aloud. And my brain can handle that speed because, again, we can take in that information far faster than we usually give ourselves credit for, and far faster than we can often read it ourselves. And so the combination of those two mediums, the physical book and the audiobook simultaneously, has for me done wonders with comprehension and retention.
Yeah, I've been thinking about doing that. I'm just too cheap to buy the same book twice. But just following on that subject. So, I mean, we are familiarized with a real typical book and now Kindle device. But what do you think about not necessarily reading, but listening to a book? Or I kid sometimes when I interview someone, I don't have the time to read the whole book. I read a summary of their books, and I wonder if I'm falling short or if there's an acceptable replacement for reading.
Well, I think they can be acceptable replacements. Oftentimes, I would probably say temporary acceptable replacements. And by that, I mean, depending on where your season in life, or depending on the genre of book you're reading, I think any one of those formats can suffice. For example, there was a time in my life where my schedule was such, or at least I viewed it this way, whether I was right or not is another issue entirely, but I viewed my schedule as not having any time to read unless I leveraged my commute. And so to do that, obviously, I listened to books on my commute. So I still got books in, got reading in that way, and leverage that time that might otherwise end up being wasted. And to me, that was a great use of that time. I disliked my commute a great deal, and listening to books was also a way for me to like or dislike my commute less. It made it less painful by listening to podcasts and audiobooks. And now that I'm not in that season of life anymore, it's rare that I listen to an audiobook unless I'm doing that combination of things I talked about a moment ago. If I've got to get through a book quickly, maybe for an interview, then I might lean on a summary, or I might use a technique we talk about in this book called skimming. Now that sounds on the surface obvious what it might be, but there's an actual technique to it that we outline in the book. So, if you're in a place where you need to implement or execute something fast. The ideas that you're going to take away from a book pretty quickly. Then you might be in a place where you want to get through it as fast as you can, and maybe an audiobook sped up or skimming the book, the physical book may aid you in doing that. So depending on where you're at, what season in life you're in, and the style of book. Let's say it's fiction. Maybe you enjoy listening to fiction more than sitting down with a physical book. Or if you're like me, you love to read biographies. I enjoy listening to a biography probably more than I enjoy sitting down and reading a biography. And the genre is such that, it's not necessarily the kind of book I'm going to go out and then act on these 5 things when I get done. I'm really listening to it for how it impacts my thinking, or it's one of those books I'm reading for that reason, for how it impacts my thinking of the world and how this person approached a certain set of obstacles in their life, and etc. And so listening to a book of that nature on an audiobook is a format I generally prefer for that particular genre of book versus sitting down with a physical book. But if it's a book I'm going to take action on, if it's a book I'm going to implement ideas from and have that to-do list at the end of the day, then I'm probably going to prefer the physical book so I can mark it up and hold it in my hand and highlights it and that sort of thing.
Okay, Jeff. The last, I have hundreds of questions here, but I promise you I wouldn't keep you for long. So I know that you have some kind of promotion going on. The book is going to be going on sale in about a week or so. So can you tell us, first of all, repeat the title of the book and tell us what promotion you are giving the listeners, and finally, where can people follow you?
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, the book is Read to Lead, the simple habit that expands your influence and boosts your career. So it's really for 2 groups of people. If you're not convinced yet that this is a habit that you need, give us the first 4 chapters, because in those chapters we make the argument for why you need to read like your career depends on it. And you'll also learn how to make a habit of it once we've convinced you of that. But maybe you're already convinced that this is a habit you need to cultivate, and maybe you're already doing that. Don't discount the book. There are plenty of tips and resources, some of which we've talked about, to help you make the most of the books you're reading. So you've got that to look forward to. The book can be found at readtoleadbook.com. And until August 31st, so if you're hearing this and it's before August 31st, 2021, you can get the book for 40% off when you choose our publisher as your vendor of choice, which is Baker Bookhouse. There are 6 on the website, but choose Baker to get 40% off. None of the others are offering that. And also, when you purchase it there and pre-order it there, I should say, you get access to several $100s in additional resources, which, by the way, includes the audiobook. So you can buy the physical book at 40% off. It's about $11, and get the audiobook for free. You get a mini course that my co-author Jesse and I have created to help you take action on the points that we're making in the book and some of the techniques. There's a bonus chapter that's not in the book that I wrote, and several other items as well. So all that's available when you pre-order at readtoleadbook.com and choose Baker to get the 40% off as well. And that's, again, through August 31st. If you're hearing this and it's after August 31st, we'd still love you to check out the book at readtoleadbook.com. If you're unsure, if you're not quite certain it's for you, I encourage you to kick the tires, as the saying goes. You can download the introduction of the book and the first chapter for free. And so I encourage you to do that. Readtoleadbook.com. If you want to find out more about my podcast, that's readtoleadpodcast.com. So I look forward to seeing you in one of those 2 spots.
And all the links will be on the show notes. Jeff, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate the questions.